Okay, we're gonna continue on. Um, Next we have the Wild Horse Fire Brigade, and we have Bill Simpson here. He is the founder and executive director, and he has Michelle with him also, and I'm gonna let them talk about themselves and get on with their presentation because I know he's got a lot of information to share, and I know we haven't had always had time for all the questions people have. So welcome, Bill and Michelle. Thank you for being here, and we'll hand everything over to you.
All right, thank you for having us.
Yeah, we appreciate it, and thanks for putting the event on. And this is William Simpson. I'm the executive director and founder of Wild Horse Fire Brigade, and we're coming to you from our wilderness research site. We call it Wild Horse Ranch. We're up here basically on the border of Oregon and California in the Siskiyou Mountains. We're at an elevation of about 3,000 feet, and I'm here with my partner, Michelle. Michelle has a Master of Science, and her minor was in behavioral ecology. And so I'll let Michelle just give you a quick little update about herself. You want to say anything about it?
Yeah, so I'm on the executive board of Wild Horse Fire Brigade, and basically I'm a fellow researcher out here, and as well as photographer, and a avid horse lover. Very much love the horses out here.
So we're going to go ahead and proceed with our slide deck. This first image is one of Michelle's images. It shows us some of our cultural heritage horses here. And this is actually right on our landscape. Most of the pictures you're going to see that we show are horses that are on our landscape or in the open area here. We are in a wilderness area and it's open range. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. Um, so this is in the background there, you can kind of see this was taken before the dams were removed. So there's actually a river in the background now. But that's who we are, a picture of us. So
So Professor Linklater, he's on our board, so we work very closely with him in coordinating student internships and research projects. So when we asked him to share his thoughts about us with the advocates, this is what he had to say. Wild horses only give up the secrets of their lives and their relationship with the environment if we're prepared to devote ourselves to meeting them where they are. If patient and persistent in our observations, the nuances of their behavior and ecology are revealed. It is because of that sort of patience and persistence that William Simpson and Michelle Gough of Wild Horse Fire Brigade have arrived at ways of appreciating the value of wild horses in North American landscapes that promise to reframe our relationship with wild horses for decades to come. So I thought this was such a beautiful way to express how important he feels our work is for now and for the future of wild horses.
okay.
Oh, there we go. So Professor Julie Murphy, she's also on our board, and this is what she had to say. Bill and Michelle's research uncovers a pivotal yet often overlooked role of wild horses as ecosystem engineers in wildfire mitigation, addressing a critical gap in the scientific understanding. With more than 20,000 hours of firsthand observation, their work demonstrates how free-roaming horses naturally regulate fuel loads, shape vegetation patterns, and support fire-adapted ecosystems. These findings provide a critical foundation for advancing empirical research and developing land management strategies that work in harmony with nature. Supporting this research is essential to fully recognizing the ecological value of wild horses and unlocking sustainable nature-based solutions to wildfire risk. So she's also very passionate about the future of wild horses, and she acknowledges how important our work is. I also want to add that both professors did their dissertations on wild horses.
And probably importantly is both Dr. Murphy and Dr. Linkletter have been here to the research facility and visited and seen the heritage herd and the facility and the landscape up here. So they're quite familiar with what we're doing. So we're looking at a plan we call the formal name for legislators, the Natural Wildfire Abatement and Forest Protection Plan. We just call it Wild Horse Fire Brigade because really, when you think about what horses do naturally, is they're part of Mother Nature's management system for grass and brush, and along with the other major herbivores. Oh, however, equids are quite different than ruminants. And most people out there know the difference. You know, you're looking at a ruminant with a multi-chambered stomach versus a single stomach horse. And so the digestion is very important, and also the anatomy of their mouth and their hooves set a big difference between the impact of horses, which evolved on this landscape, and invasive species, cattle, sheep, and goats, which evolved in Africa in the old world. Now, we started studying horses up here. I started studying horses back in 2014, and then for a long time things were going on. And we'll talk more about what happened on the landscape here. We had a big fire up here, 38,000 acre fire. But in 2022, we met with the Ag Commissioner, and he's been getting research from us quite regularly. And in 2022, Michelle and I met with him, and it was actually in February, we had a meeting, and then in March we got a letter after our meeting, and they're well aware of the horses, they're well aware of our research and what we do, and the rescues that we've done and all the work on the landscape. And so in 2022, the county gave us ownership of our herd of horses up here, which is a very important step. And what it did is there's jurisdictional semantics that a lot of people don't understand. When a wild horse is standing in an HMA or in a U.S. Forest Service territory, it is a capital WH wild horse, and it's protected under the Act of 71. But when that horse steps over the line into another area, he could become, depending on what land he's standing on, jurisdictionally, he could become unauthorized livestock, or that horse could become a feral horse. And so in our case, in Siskiyou County, they were considered feral horses because there is no HMA here right by our ranch or in this particular wildlife area. So they had control. They had jurisdictional control of the horses, and therefore were able to give us the ownership. On top of which, we'd been spending a lot of money every year caring for the horses and providing things that they needed to assure the sustainability, because they'd suffer quite a bit of I should say, bad behavior by humans, people just stealing them and grabbing them. And because when I was a kid up here, there was hundreds and hundreds of them. And then when I retired here, there was only about 100 in this immediate area. So it was pretty shocking, the decline. So in 2017, we rescued and rewilded 19 wild horses and integrated them into our herd. On the left is a local stallion. His name is Romeo, and he's a local boy. And we had a trailer pull up with these 19 horses that had been rescued by a sanctuary down in Southern California. And and I'm not going to name the people of the sanctuary, but they ran into some difficulties, and they had some amazing horses that they'd collected over the years because they were special horses and, rare genetics and so forth. So when I heard about it and they said, gee, could you help us, Bill? We said, of course we can. So we got those horses up here, and when they opened the trailer door, they came out. It was we had a livestock hauler bring them up, and they'd already been sequestered in quarantine, so we knew they were safe. And when we opened the door, Romeo just happened to be standing there, and at the time he was a 4-year-old bachelor, and he saw this family of horses come out, and he goes, "Oh, okay." Well, interestingly, since 2017, he's kept that entire family together, and we've had babies from some of these horses already. So it's been a very interesting examination of how these horses were successfully rewilded after being in a sanctuary for a number of years.
And this also, in this particular family band, there's also 3 geldings that help Romeo out. So it's also an example of how geldings integrate into family bands.
Yeah, it's quite interesting watching that behavioral, those dynamics in the family bands. So between 2017 and 2024, we've rewilded nearly 100 horses altogether, and our area is quite unusual. It's an ecologically balanced wilderness area that already had an existing herd of native horses. And so what the success is quite variable depending on the landscape where you're rewilding. And that's what's important. you just can't rewild horses anywhere. And that's something that we're trying to stress to people. We have to be very careful where we put horses. You certainly don't want to put a horse into an area where they're going to be in conflict right away. You don't want to remove them, like the BLM removes them from a landscape where there's a lot of unhappy people around them, let's put it that way. And so the horses bear the brunt of that. And so horses, when they're rewilded, need to be placed into a proper landscape that's ecologically appropriate, and also the landscape where it doesn't create any kind of a conflict with existing commercial enterprises, because that's the big problem right now. We've got, a lot of people don't realize there's about 300 million acres of wildlands in America, and most of that area is not controlled by the BLM. The BLM, a lot of people, when you start looking at who owns what land and this and that, of course, the BLM, I think they have about 245 million acres. The United States Forest Service, I think, has about 180 million acres. So, the U.S. Forest Service, 180 million acres is less than the BLM with 245 million. But a lot of people are not looking at, well, what other land is in America? Well, there's 354 million acres of privately owned forest. And then there's millions of other acres that are, checkerboard, and some are very large tracts of, county, state, and other federal lands that are outside the jurisdiction of the Forest Service or the BLM as far as, wildlife management. So there's a lot of places where people say, well, where can we put horses? There's actually quite a few places where we can put horses. And, if somebody waved a magic wand and they said, hey, you guys, we'll give you all the horses in America to do something with and get them out of our way. Well, after the last roundups in 2024 of May, BLM said there was roughly 59,000 horses left, according to their 2024 census, if you believe the BLM numbers. And then toward the end of the year, by the end of 24, I think they'd rounded up another 20,000 horses. So we could very well be under 40,000 free roaming wild horses left on the landscape. And then we've got about 70,000 horses that are being held off range in places like the Drummond Ranch and what have you. So there is a lot of land, and the successive land that we have that's unmanaged is suffering from annual grass and brush at ridiculous levels because there's a collapsed herbivory. We've decimated our large-bodied herbivory in North America. So most of us know the origins of American wild horses. All horses originally, evolved here about 55 million years ago, but the successful modern horse has been around, depending on whose stuff you look at, between 1.7 and 2 million years. But Ross McPhee is probably one of the leading experts in paleontology and evolution of equids. And and according to Dr. McPhee, they arose about 5 million years ago. And what's more native than a Native American wild horse? When you look at the fossil records, carbon dated fossils, bison came from Asia along with deer and elk roughly about 175,000 years ago. So less than 200,000 years ago, we got bison, deer, and elk came across from Asia on Beringia, the land bridge between Alaska and Siberia. And then horses about 1 million years ago went the other way and got into the old world across Beringia. So that's how the old world got all their horses and zebras and so forth. So what's older? A bison that's been around, let's give it credit, let's just say 200,000 years, we'll round up, or the modern horse. Of course, the modern horses is they're as American as apple pie. But because of political and economic reasons, it suits the powers that be to demonize them by using terms like invasive and not native, and these are all ways of demonizing the horses, which makes it easier for them to eliminate them, and that's just what they're doing. So who's doing it and why? See, that's the other problem. You have to understand the battlefield dynamics. Who are the generals? Who are the politicians behind the generals? And who are the soldiers? So, people keep talking about the 1971 Act and protections. I hear protections, by the BLM under the act. Well, I would tell those people, look around, tell me what protections you're seeing. I see that they have the right to be rounded up and tortured and families separated and castration and sterilization and with a lot of horses ending up in slaughter. That's the protections I see. I'm not seeing the kind of protection that President Nixon intended in 1971 when he signed that act to protect our heritage horses. You know, these are treasured icons of America, and Nixon understood that, and which is why he signed that act. I don't see any of those protections working today. And why? Well, consumerism has changed everything. Since 71, we have 100 million more Americans living in America. 100 million more people. They all want more stuff. They want, you know, phones with and computers that have lithium. They want livestock products. They want pharmaceuticals. You know, these demands, these consumer demands are driving politicians to do what they can do to maximize the yield from public lands. And what happens in reality is these big corporations, you know, command trillions of dollars in revenue. They have their revenue dwarfs the entire U.S. government's budget, and they donate on campaign donations both sides of the aisle. They fund both sides of the aisle. And when I was an internet CEO, I knew people from the big banks, Goldman Sachs and Bear Stearns in Silicon Valley. And I was talking to those guys about politics one day, and and it actually was during an election, and I was kind of asking who they think was going to win. And they says, "Well, we win no matter who loses." And I go, "What?" And they go, "Yeah, we win no matter who loses because we fund both sides of the aisle. We don't care who wins or loses because we always win." So when you fund a politician's campaign and he wins, you have the phone number to the cell phone in his suit, and that goes all the way up to the president. So, you know, when these big corporation board members need something done, they just dial a number and it rings in some powerful politician's suit, and he answers, and he's not going to bite the hand that feeds him. And so those marching orders get sent down to the DOI, to the BLM, to the U.S. Forest, and then they send the soldiers out on the landscape to do their bidding. And that's what's going on. You know, yelling at the BLM, they're soldiers on a battlefield. They're under orders. They're not going to change what they do. They're under orders. You look at some of the demands and what's driving the demands even a little deeper. If we look at the SAFE Act, for instance, well, SAFE Act's been around 20 years. Why hasn't it passed? Well, Nestle, a very powerful company in Europe, owns Purina along with a lot of other companies they own. They're a powerhouse. They're a juggernaut of a corporation. So they own Purina, and Purina has the second largest pet food plant in Mexico. Now, in order to make pet food, Purina needs meat, but Purina doesn't butcher horses. They're not involved in any of that. They buy protein meal from Mexican rendering plants. So the Mexican rendering plants get the horses and then they render them into a protein meal, which is then shipped to places like Purina. So Purina has plausible deniability. If you ask them if they butcher horses or if they're slaughtering horses, any of that, they go, "Oh, no, 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 no. We use a protein meal." And, well, where do you get it? Well, that's proprietary. We don't have to tell you. See, and that's how they get around that. You look at the meat industry, 97% of Americans buy meat products. Phenomenal business. Are we going to shut that down? No, we're not. I mean, it's just ridiculous to assume we can shut these big corporations down and bend them to our will. I mean, if we had a big checkbook, if we all got together and go, okay, we can all run around and write $100,000 campaign donation checks to both sides of the aisle, then we might have some say. But, you know, when you look at gas and oil and the extraction companies, you know, phenomenal revenues. Big pharma gets, you know, I think 1,000 products out of the you know, gas and oil industry. You look at the aggregate of these corporations that are wielding these trillions of dollars, and it is a lot of power, a lot of influence on our politicians. So as advocates, we all want to save wild horses. We all have the same desire, but we have to know how to do it. We have to have a practical approach that's based on the realities on the landscape. So you look at these logos, these are just some of the companies that basically take advantage of public lands directly or indirectly. and it's a lot. So what it comes down to is who's killing wild horses? We all are. That's the bottom line. We all are. We're all using the devices that have lithium phones. Well, guess where lithium comes from? They're finding more and more in Nevada and other places. Well, what happens? They don't want the horses on the landscape where they're going to mine lithium. It's consumerism versus wild horses. So we all have a hand in it. And nobody's going to give up what they want. Nobody's going to say, we're not going to change the 97% of Americans that eat meat. We're not going to change everybody that wants a new cell phone. We're not going to change everybody who wants a computer. We're not going to change Tesla. Everybody's buying lithium powered cars. It all comes out of the ground. And when you start doing those kinds of things, you're impacting horses. So we have to take responsibility. We all are part of the problem. It's not just the BLM. It's not the U.S. Forest. And it's really, those are just the soldiers on the landscape. It's the big corporations that are basically yielding to our demands. So what's the real solution? Well, it's been under the noses of land managers for a very long time, but they're distracted by monetizing the landscape. You look at what the U.S. Forest Service is doing. When they put the loggers out of the timber business, they all kind of looked around and they go, now what are we going to do? We were managing forests for sustained yields of timber, trees, lumber. We don't do that anymore. What are we going to do? Well, you look at the U.S. Forest Service budget. I read a lot of financial documents. And I think now they're probably at $10 billion a year in funding, and 90% of what they spend it on is on fire suppression. So that's firefighting. And it's funny how they tailor words. Suppression is an interesting term. It almost sounds like prevention, but it's not. Suppression means firefighting. And and that comes after the problems exploded out of the ground. You basically, hey, the forest is on fire. All right, now what are we going to do? Let's go fight fire. And let's spend, $10 billion a year doing that. They don't want to look at prevention, because the problem with prevention from their chair is prevention puts people out of business. It breaks people's rice bowls. You've got all these people now going to fire training schools, and the schools are making money, and the Forest Service is making money, and Gates company is making money because they sell fire hose. And you could go down a long list of people that are making money on wildfire. And so if we say, well, we want to reduce fire, they kind of look at you with one eyebrow raised, kind of like, what? You're going to interfere with our revenue? But hey, how long can we burn America before there's nothing left? That's the question. These people have very little vision, and that's a problem. Each wild horse that we rewild properly and we put them into the right areas will yield $72,000 worth of value over its lifetime. Now, I came up with that. I wrote a big article about this a number of years ago, maybe 7 years ago, I think. The thing about a horse is it can reduce fire fuel all year long without any risk of creating a fire. You look at what are the band-aids they have out there? Well, prescribed fire. What's that do? Well, first of all, they almost burned New Mexico to the ground with a prescribed fire that got out of control a couple years ago. And that's happened twice in New Mexico. Back in 2000, it happened before. So, and we see that all over the place. These fires go out of control. And the big question with prescribed fire, and they call it RX fire, they have a lot called ecocultural burning. They put all kinds of new name tags, they rebrand it, but it's basically burning the ground, burning the landscape. What we have to ask, is that scalable? Are we going to be able to burn 300 million acres in Western United States? Of course not. We can't. And when you burn a landscape that has prodigious fuel loads because the herbivories collapsed, it burns abnormally hot. That's a big problem. And now they're actually starting to recite that in range management plans. When you burn a landscape with prescribed fire that doesn't have the proper herbivory, the fire burns abnormally hot. It damages the entire landscape. It pasteurizes the soil down 7 to 10 inches deep. It heats the soil so hot, it kills all the microbiome in the soil, which those little critters, those little microorganisms make plant food. The fires are so hot now, we're seeing a new kind of toxic smoke. We're seeing fires that are at 1,500 to 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit they're so hot that we see aluminum engine blocks melted in these areas. We see mag wheels melted, aluminum ladders melted, the steel beams deformed. That's not normal fire. That's abnormal fire. And these are grass and brush fires we're talking about now. Grass and brush burns abnormally hot, especially when you put a wind on it, because you're injecting oxygen and you're accelerating combustion. So when you do the math, a wild horse will consume about 5.5 tons of wildfire fuels every year. And they do that for about 20 years that they live in the wilderness. I compared that with the other ways of dealing with grass and brush, and even the ones that aren't scalable, like prescribed fire. We can't burn. We'd be lucky if we could actually burn, here and there. It makes a little bit of sense, but it's not a large solution. It's not scalable onto the landscape. But when you look at what that costs, it can be up to $4,000 an acre, especially if you're doing a prescribed burn where you need structure protection nearby, things like that. I've talked to the Mennonites and the Amish about, because they do it by hand with a scythe. I've looked at mowing, mulching, and all the other methodologies per acre, and then calculated it against the average tonnage of fuel in wildlands. And so when you do all the math, it comes out to, by removing 5.5 tons annually over 20 years, each horse gives us taxpayer $72,000 in value. That is a lot of money. And when you want to contrast with people in an argument, hey, you can send that horse to slaughter, but what are you going to get? Okay, you're not going to get $72,000 or nowhere near it. So that's a ripoff for the American taxpayer. These horses not only deserve to be wild and free, but they do a very important job that has phenomenal value to taxpayers. California fires and everywhere else on the West Coast are going out of control. We keep throwing more and more money at them like crazy. Oregon is throwing hundreds of millions of dollars. And last year, by the way, even after Senate Bill 762, where they put $2.5 million on the table 4 years ago, saying, "Oh yeah, we're going to really get a leash on these fires." Well, that was 4 years ago. They spent all that money, bought all kinds of equipment and everything. Didn't apply anything towards prevention, bought a whole bunch of equipment and helicopters and more engines and this and that. Well, last year in Oregon, it was the worst year ever. It was 1.9 million acres got incinerated. And so this is a graph that I used in a previous presentation that only went up to 2020. But I got some other information coming. But we're chasing. It's like a VW bug chasing a Porsche down the freeway. We're not catching these fires no matter how much money we spend, because we're not dealing with prevention. We're dealing with the crisis after it already happens. In 2018, in May, we had the Klamathon fire. Or actually in May of 2018, let me back up here. In May of 2018, Colorado University came down, or Colorado College, and we're filming a documentary about our plan, and they called the film Fuel, Fire, and Wild Horses. So some of the professors up there looked at our concepts for increasing the herbivory where it's depleted with horses. And they thought, well, that's great. So they did a graduate film thesis, Fuel, Fire, and Wild Horses. They came down and we filmed the entire area where 2 months later the Klamathon fire burned. So we had a very interesting study here. We had extensive footage and film pictures of the areas we had controlled fuel. We had grazed down basically what you would call fire breaks. And some of these fire breaks one of them was 3,000 acres on Agate Flat. And so these fire breaks were instrumental in helping CAL FIRE stop the Klamathon fire, which was wind-blown, grass and brush fire. It was going so fast you could hardly stay in front of it if you ran. And it was on its way to burning Ashland to the ground, which is a college town full of kids, and the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument. So interestingly, we were able to document before the fire, during the fire. So I was boots on the ground during the fire. CAL FIRE recruited me as their technical advisor because I know the area intimately. I know where all the logging roads are. I knew where all the fire breaks were. And so I guided, because they sent CAL FIRE from Fresno up here. Of course, they were lost. They'd never been here before. and their maps were incomplete. They didn't show the logging roads. They didn't show where the ranch houses were or the outbuildings. So I became an incremental part of their team, and I did that for free. I was a volunteer. I wasn't interested in making money. I did this because we wanted to help save the community, save the forest, save Ashland. And secondarily, I wanted to see what the horses would do during a wildfire because there's been no research on, what do wild horses do when they're right in front of a wildfire? What happens? Well, I know now because I actually watched the horses during the fire. I watched their behavior. I watched what they do. Wild horses are not afraid of fire. This is a family of horses that graze the area that's burning back there. And instead of having 200-foot tall flames, which it had just when it was 2 miles away from here, the fire was lower with less intensity. And on top of that, we were also seeing that the horses were not afraid of this fire. They just continued grazing right in front of the fire. And in the far right hand of the screen, there's two U.S. Forest Service fire trucks that I can't see them because I have a drop down, but there's two green trucks.
So I just want to add, we've been talking about how the natural grazing habits created many thousand-acre fire breaks, and that's what gave Cal Fire the advantage. They needed to stop the fire before it made its way into the Cascades Siskiyou National Monument. And just to give you an idea, it's one of the most diverse ecosystems in the Cascade Range. The elevation is ranged from 2,100 to 6,100 feet, and it's a convergence of the Cascade, Klamath, and Siskiyou mountain ranges. It's about 114,000 acres, and it's just this really amazing mosaic of forest, woodlands, grasslands, wet meadows, and interior desert. So it's a really special place, and there's more than 300 species of birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians, and many of them are actually rare or endemic. And there's also a healthy population of apex predators. So if it weren't for the horses, that area would have been decimated by this wildfire.
So wildfire smoke is not the same as it was 20, 30 years ago. Wildfire smoke is now so hot, and the fires are so hot, it's creating new compounds. There's a new chemistry that's happening in the fire. Um, we're seeing, we went from fires that were 800, 900 degrees to maybe 1,000 degrees to fires now that we know are over 16, 1,800 degrees because we see aluminum engine blocks melting. That doesn't happen. Aluminum melts at about 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. So there's all over the place melted aluminum ladders, molten aluminum mags, molten aluminum engine blocks, deformed steel. That happens at 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. So when in chemistry, and Michelle and I both studied chemistry and physics and things, if you put three compounds into a test tube and let's say you heat it at 800 degrees, you're going to get certain resulting products. Now, if you take those same exact compounds and put them in a test tube and you heat them at 1,800 degrees, you're going to get brand new compounds. They're going to be different because of the different kind of chemistry at that temperature. What we're seeing now is these fires are so hot that metals in the ground, minerals in the ground are sublimating. Sublimation is when a compound goes from a solid and it skips the liquid phase and goes right to a gaseous phase. So these metals, there's all kinds of metal in the ground, copper, aluminum, zinc, you name it, you got all kinds of minerals. What's happening is during these fires, you're getting superheated smoke, you're getting sublimated metals that are going up into this smoke column, and you're getting this brand new chemistry. Now, the toxins in the smoke, the common thing that everybody thinks of is carbon monoxide poisoning. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about novel compounds that are in the class of carcinogens. Now, of course, I know about this because the toxins in smoke killed my wife. So, and I consulted with a lot of people, top experts in the United States in this area, and Dr. Michelle Block at the Indiana Medical University, who studies toxins in smoke, confirmed my suspicion back in 2019. So, and now UCLA has come out with a study saying that 5,000 Californians a year are dying prematurely from toxins in the smoke. So they've confirmed what I had to learn the hard way a long time ago. So And this is an article, this abstract from Science Advances. You can Google UCLA death toll from wildfire smoke. There, the UCLA study comes up, but this is the abstract from the study, and they said that about 55,000 people died prematurely from wildland fire smoke, and they're talking about PM 2.5, but it goes past that even into these novel compounds. So critical components of fire. It's shocking to me that news reporters don't even know the fire triangle that we learned about in the Cub Scouts. So in order to have a fire, you have to have oxygen, fuel, and heat. And so you'll hear people on the news, oh yeah, it was a wind fueled fire. Wind doesn't fuel a fire. Okay, fuel fuels the fire. When you have wind on a grass and brush fire, what it does is it injects oxygen at a higher rate and it accelerates the rate of combustion, which accelerates and expands the BTUs, the British thermal units, or the heat that's expanded into the environment. In other words, when you put wind on a fire, you're inject like a blacksmith's bellows. You're injecting more oxygen and you make it burn hotter. And so these wind-driven fires are extremely hot because grass and brush burns faster than heavy fuels. Like, trees, you can have a wind on a tree, but it's not going to burn, it can't burn it at an accelerated rate because you only have so much surface area. With grass and brush, you have a phenomenal amount of surface area on the vegetative material. So by injecting oxygen with a wind, you can accelerate the rate of combustion and therefore increase the level of heat to the level where we see incineration of, places like the Palisades. Houses just melted to the ground. Here's an example of a forensic report from InsaWeb. This is the government site where they talk about what happened on a fire, how many acres, where it was, the latitude, longitude, etc. And I've looked at probably several hundred of these and studying the incidents of grass and brush fires because I was very interested in knowing how many of these fires have grass and brush as the primary fuels. Well, here's an example. They got tall grass and brush in a fire, the McKinney fire, which did a lot of damage. Not only did it torch the landscape, but it created unstable soils. And then there was a rainstorm, and all that they had a lahore of mud that went down into the Klamath River, and it killed all the fish for 70 miles in the Klamath River. There was a big article in the news about that. So what's causing catastrophic fire? Well, we know we have a collapse of the herbivory. If you look at the right side of this graph, it's actually where you have that last little line of decline, be the right hand third of the graph, starting in 1992 and going down, and it continues to drop all the way till today. The deer in California have collapsed. The same thing in Oregon and Colorado. Everywhere I've looked in the Western United States, we see a collapse in the deer. And that's because the Fish and Wildlife departments are selling deer tags and elk tags at a rate that helps them monetize their business model, which is shooting animals. I mean, Elmer Fudd's been out there shooting a lot of large-bodied herbivores, and that has cost us dearly because especially in the Western United States, our herbivores are pretty much gone. I mean, there are very few left, and interestingly, in California, California Fish and Wildlife still sells deer tags. Quite frankly, I think they wouldn't care if there was 1,000 deer left in the whole state. They'd probably still be selling deer tags because that's how they get their money and pay all their employees. Do they care if a hunter gets a deer? No. But when you sell 1,000,000 deer tags, you got 1,000,000 Elmer Fudds out there with high-powered telescopic, optics rifles, and they're blasting these animals, and then you have poaching and vehicular accident and so forth. So we have a documented decrease in the herbivory. Now, coupled with that, we also know from a brand new study by Radeloff that and his team that grassland and shrubland fires represent 66% of all wildfires. So the top line, that light green line, that's grass and brush fires. The dark green line down below is forest fires. And as we see, grass and brush fires, that's the elephant in the room. It's 2 to 1. So, And we also know from insurance records and all kinds of news media reports and scientific studies that the vast majority of human deaths come from grass and brush fires. The vast majority of economic damages, loss of business, and so on and so forth, homes and homelessness are coming from grass and brush fueled wildfires, not forest fires. Now, that's not to say forest fires aren't a problem. They are, because that destroys habitat for wildlife. But we have to start talking about prevention in an intelligent manner. And, I tell people if we're all out fishing in a boat and suddenly we have a 1 inch hole in the boat and water coming in, and we have a 6 inch hole in the boat and water coming in, what hole do you fill first? What hole do you patch first? Well, you do the big one first because that's sinking you. And that's what's happening right now. These grass and brush fires are really a problem. So there's a lot of science published out there. Dr. William J. Ripple at Oregon State, here's a study from the Royal Society. If we rewild, trophic rewilding basically will stop fires. It will help reduce the frequency, the intensity, and the size of these fires. So there's a lot of science. There's no argument there. We know what the solution is. We need to reestablish our herbivory. And of course, cervids are out of inventory. You just can't go find deer and elk to drop them back on the landscape. That's going to take probably a 20-year management plan and arguments with the hunting industry, because we're going to probably need a moratorium on hunting to bring back the deer and the elk. In the meantime, what do? Well, we've got 70,000 large herbivores in government holding. It's ridiculous. It's like having the fire department in jail during the fire season. So we have all these, and we're paying over $150 million a year to feed them and take care of them. If we rewild those horses into appropriate areas, okay, and that involves, that's a long conversation because it has to be the right ecosystem. You can't just put these horses anywhere. And you don't want to put them into an area where there's going to be economic conflict either. You want them to be wild and free, and you don't want any conflicts. And there's plenty of places to do that. That's not a problem. So we know it works. So that's the point here. We know it works, and we have empirical evidence of that. With it right up here, we stopped a fire with our herd of horses. So America, this is a really nice little slide that was courtesy of Canna Foundation. And actually, early on, when I was talking with Hooter Helmer at Rewilding Europe published my 5-year preliminary study back in 2019 in their wildfire-focused journal. It's called Gray's Life. And I got to know Mr. Dr. Helmer, and he had one of these graphs for Europe, and I talked to him about that, and I said, hey, we need one of these for America. We need we don't need a conic horse in the middle. We need the American wild horse in the middle because, hey, they all came from here anywhere. So let's do this right. You got your horses from us. They're Americans. It's kind of like I tell my friends, if we all fly to Switzerland, I'm sorry, and go on vacation, are we suddenly Swiss because we're in Switzerland? No, we're Americans. It doesn't matter where you put them. These are American wild horses. So they did this really nice little cartoon for Canna, and it shows the interactions in what kind of a glance here, how important to all the other co-evolved species of flora and fauna the horses are. They're critical, and we see that all day, every day up here because we live with them. So back in 2018, in February, well, actually before that, in 2016-17, I became very concerned about chronic wasting disease because, I know people in Colorado and in the Midwest that was suffering from the serious decline of cervids because of chronic wasting disease, which is a deadly disease. It's fatal in all cases. It doesn't matter. There's no cure, and it's fatal. And so when Enviro News was starting to talk to Dr. Mark Zabel about this, Dr. Zabel is he's a medical doctor and a PhD at the Prion Research Center in Fort Collins, Colorado. Dr. Zabel and I started talking about this, and then in 2018, we talked to Enviro News about chronic wasting and the importance of the wild horse, because, and I learned a lot from Dr. Zabel. Before I talked to him, I didn't realize, and this was back, of course, in in 2017, I didn't realize that horses are resistant to chronic wasting disease. Who knew? And then I also didn't know that lions, bears, wolves, and coyotes and bobcats do not contract the disease or spread it. So if they eat an infected carcass, they don't get sick and they don't spread the disease. So they're like the garbage men out there. So if you have a deer that's suffering from chronic wasting disease, normally, if you have a proper predator population, they get taken out of the population very quickly before they can spread the disease. Well, what's happened over the last 100 years? Ranchers in the Midlands on these grazing areas that have been used for 200 years in some places have shot all the predators because they don't want them eating their calves and their sheep. So what's happened? They've removed the Mother Nature's solution to the spread of chronic wasting disease. But also, as I learned, the vector for the disease, because it's a prion, it's not a bacteria or a virus, it's a prion. So it's a misshapen protein. The vector is the vegetative material. And when you had a proper herd of horses, they could eat the infected materials, the vegetative materials, and they don't get sick, and then they don't spread the disease. They take it out of the food chain, which limits the amount of the disease that the deer and elk could eat. So the horses were doing a very important job, but in the early 1900s, we had 3 million horses. Guess what? We're probably down to under 40,000 that are free roaming. So here again, we've shot ourselves in the foot because of bad management. Okay. So education, very important. We're going to start talking about our program here after Professor Linkletter came up. And of course, Dr. Julie Mufree had been here too. He saw that we had an unusual opportunity. We had a cultural heritage herd of native wild horses. We owned them, which means we don't have to apply to the BLM to do a study. Now, I think anybody out there would know if we all went to the BLM and said, hey, we want to go on HMA and we want to do this study and we want to, radio tag the horses and we want to do this and that and figure out what they're doing. The BLM would say, okay, go ahead and submit your study proposal, and they'd push it around for probably 6 months or longer, and then they'd come back and probably say no, because they're only interested in eradicating horses. Why? Because of the economic pressure. That's why. They're not. But if you have a program to exterminate them quicker, you probably get funding. So and permission to go use the herd for that. Now our herd, because they're probably the largest herd of native horses that are privately owned, living in a balanced wildland ecosystem, we're able to study these horses. We don't need to get permission from the government. These are our horses. That's a benefit because they're protected also because we own them. Now they're considered jurisdictionally as livestock. So nobody can touch them, nobody can hurt them. They're protected, and that's very important. That's a real protection too, because as livestock owners, we could perform citizens arrest. Anybody tries to hurt our horses, we have all kinds of laws. Guess what? They're written to protect the livestock industry. We're using them to protect our horses now. So it's a twist. Thinking out of the box has great value. That's what we do at Wild Horse Fire Brigade. We think out of the box. And that's because of the multitude of people on our board. We have a vast array of professionals who understand all kinds of unusual nuances in various levels. And then my background is all over the map. So we signed a 5-year contract with Cal State University, and now we're putting students through our program. And so far we've had 8 students pass through the program. These students now, they're environmental study students. They understand horses. They did what we call it the Goodall method, because we live with them and study them. And we do that in honor of Jane Goodall, who basically did the same thing. She figured out how to get to know the apes and then be part of the family. And that's when she saw them making and using tools and made her breakthrough. So we've made a lot of breakthroughs too. We've discovered and published things that haven't been known before. So it's really pays off. And so the kids are going through the program. I shouldn't say kids, young adults. I guess I'm getting too old now. My kids are 40. So, but the students are learning quite a bit. And being here with the horses, there is no substitute, absolutely no substitute for empirical experience. Being out here with real wild horses in the wilderness, in the landscape, and it's a wilderness field study program. They're seeing the real deal, okay? And they're taking away the heart of the horse with them. They have that intricate understanding. They see the love between the family bands. They see their benefits on the environment. They're absorbing it. The 2 weeks, it's an intensive immersion course, and these students are really benefiting. So in addition to the rate of the fuel reduction, we've talked a little bit about, how they benefit the forests, but they also benefit our watersheds and ecosystems. When they create these fire breaks, we're protecting the ground cover. A lot of people don't realize, but you need to have cover crops around your forest. And what the cover crops do, a lot of them are nitrogen fixing plants like lupin. That's a nitrogen fixing legume. So it puts nitrogen in the ground. If that gets burned off, suddenly you don't have that benefit anymore, putting nitrogen in the ground. That's fertilizer for the trees. There's the coevolution of the flora in a landscape is amazing. It's taken millions of years for this. It's kind of like business dealings between species. There's a saying that the Lakota have, I believe it's the Lakota, I could be wrong, that the grass knows the horse. That's poetic ecology. It's saying that the grass knows that it's going to feed the horse, but the grass knows that the horse is going to continue its life cycle by pooping out its seeds and continuing that grass's life cycle to the next generation and so forth. So, I could spend hours just talking about this one thing, but what these horses do is important. And just from the simple point of stopping fire, these big fire breaks protect forests. And this is what we saw up here. Here in the far left slide, you see a little family of horses. Hey, they created that big fire break that's protecting those old growth trees, which are the habitat for hundreds of different animals in there. So, similarly, horses, the poop that comes out, it's full of seed. You can actually, in that middle slide, you actually see a seedling of a lupin plant in the right side of that little picture on that slide. That's a lupin among the grasses. But, we just completed a grazing study with oversight from Cal State and UC Davis. We had a master's student up here from UC Irvine that came up through a veterinary school in Davis. We completed a germinability of horse dung study, and we just completed a grazing study and the oversight of 2 universities. It was scientists here, students here. We're not worried about somebody stepping on a plant or anything. I mean, this is a wilderness area. We have scientists and students who are smart people. They can be up here and see it. It's important that they see it. That gives you validation. There's a lot of people who say things, but hey, those are just words. Show us. Maybe I'm from Kansas, I guess. Show me. I want to see it. I want to see the evidence. Show me the empirical evidence. We show that. And the far right slide, Michelle,
I wanted to talk about the picture on the far right. So that essentially shows the theoretical benefits of how the horse's relationship with a tree makes it fire resilient. So when you actually go hiking in the backcountry here, you can still see the impacts and devastation from the 2018 Klamathon fire had on the forest and the woodlands here. And as you hike down the paths, that theoretical becomes empirical because there's a dramatic difference in the areas frequented by the horses versus the areas where the horses didn't really spend much time. The trees that the horses didn't have a relationship, that had the limbs that went all the way to the length of the tree down to the ground, and they were choked with grass and brush. Well, those trees burned catastrophically and subsequently didn't survive. And we're talking about fire evolved conifers. Um, but then there's this really dramatic difference where the horses had a relationship with the trees, and they created those fire ladders. They maintained the grass and brush to nominal levels, and so those sections of the forest are still pristine. And so without those horses, that whole forest would have been, gone up in flames. And just to try to give you a picture, the section of trees that burned were on one side of a creek versus the trees that didn't burn were on the other side of the creek. And the grass and brush is still maintained. And then there's various piles of horse dung that are of varying ages. So you can see that the horses do spend a lot of time in that area.
Yeah, and just one more note on that far right slide showing the tree. You can see the ground was burned under the tree, the fire went right under that tree and didn't burn the tree because it burned low and slow because of low fuel loads, because of the horses grazing. And you can actually see a little stud pile under the tree. But that tree survived the fire like a lot of other trees because it was used as a shelter. So Band-Aids versus solutions to save American wild horses. We've got to be honest with ourselves. I mean, looking at the 30 years of advocacy, the history of the advocacy, all the things that have been tried, do we want to keep doing the stuff that didn't work at any level? If it didn't work, we need to move on. And so, we hear about sterilizing horses that'll stop roundups. Does it really? Empirical evidence shows that it doesn't stop roundups, not at all. One example of many examples is, of course, the Oniki herd. There's an organization there that on their website actually talks about using birth control or whatever you want to call it, fertility control, as sterilization for 20 years. They've used it for 20 years, and then of course in 2022 the BLM came in and rounded up 450 horses. Did it stop the roundup? No. Sanctuaries, relocating horses into large fenced areas. Isn't that what the BLM does with the Drummond Ranch? I mean, the problem with a sanctuary is you can't own enough land to have a truly balanced wild ecosystem, which is what a wild horse needs. It needs to be in the presence of all of its co-evolved flora and fauna, including the predators. So the Drummond Ranch, that's just, they got a lot of acres. You got 4,000 acres. Is that rewilding? Of course not. And then you've got these other places that have, 20, 30, 1,000 acres, but those are not balanced ecosystems. They look nice. It's a beautiful landscape, but you got to remember, you've got to have all of the components, all of the co-evolved flora and fauna with your wild horses to have what nature intended. And natural selection is a very important part of that. And natural selection extends beyond just predation, bad weather, grazing conditions, disease, all kinds of things are part of Mother Nature's test on all of the families in the herd, and from the babies right up to the adults. She's constantly testing them to have the very best genetics go forward. So weakness is taken out. Animals that can't handle cold weather. You look at the Big Summit herd in Eastern Oregon. They're up there at 8,000 feet. They've been there 300 years. They can handle cold weather. They probably some died to get that genetics, the epigenetic group that's up there now that's been exposed for all those years to heavy snow and super cold weather to what you have now. Those horses handle it. They live there. They're happy there. Of course, they want to take those out now because they want to put sheep up there, the U.S. forest. Putting horses back where they were just removed from the BLM, okay, that's never going to fly because we just talked about the corporations that run the whole political, kabuki show. They're calling the shots. They're not going to let that happen. They have designs for that landscape, and they have the money to make sure they win. We cannot beat them. Litigation, yeah, we've litigated ourselves. We stopped the BLM roundup, but we realize we're tactically aware that just buys us time to gain support. We need to make our management opportunity and our plan available to a large scale of people, and then get the support and then get it implemented. So we're trying to buy time wherever we can. And unfortunately, what happens in many cases is when you litigate in an area where there's a lot of livestock production or whatever that's desired in a particular area, and this is unfortunate, a lot of horses end up shot dead after people win litigation. So, you look at, if you Google LA Times 2018, 450 wild horses shot dead. This is on a BLM piece of land in northern Nevada. The BLM, or I guess a hiker discovered all these dead horses. They went in there. There's 450 horses, wild horses shot dead. 450. And the BLM said, oh, we don't know what happened. Yeah, of course not.
Hey, Bill.
And nobody's ever been caught.
Bill, I'm sorry. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we only have about 15 or 20 minutes left for questions. So I'm wondering.
Okay, I'm going to wrap here.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to wrap real quick.
Okay.
So how can we implement wild? This is the important part. Why can we have two paths? Okay, we have the existing law, humane transfer of excess animals. which the BLM will not tell you about. They lie by omission. But if you Google BLM, Humane Transfer of Excess Animals, guess what? It comes right up on their website. So what that means is any government agency, a county fire department, a city, county, state can go to the BLM. They say, we want horses, and they got to give them to them. And then when you get them, they come with protections. They don't lose their, and of course, what BLM protection do they really have, right? But they have to sign a document. The government agency, whether it's a state or county, signs a document, and you get them, and then their jurisdictional tag, they become work animals, and doing fuel reduction is work. So this all works, and we've got 2 lawyers on our board. They both looked at it. Mike Harris is probably one of the most winning litigators in wildlife out there. He worked for Friends of Animals for 7 years. He looked at it. We have an article online about this. It works. And then the other thing we're working on is amending Section 1339 of the 71 Act to allow relocation of wild horses from areas where they're deemed in conflict into other wilderness areas that are ecologically and economically appropriate. So there's 2 paths, and we're going to work on that. If Wild Horse Fire Brigade's implemented, it's going to save a phenomenal amount of money for taxpayers in the insurance industry. You know, we just saw I mean, I could go down all these numbers here, but you know, warehousing captured horses, 100 million, or actually it's 150 million now. Rewilding those horses, you know, we save that right off the top. That 150 million gets saved immediately. Wildfire damage, I mean, we're talking probably this year in California, we may hit $1 trillion in damages. The LA fire alone, they're talking $300 billion, a third of $1 trillion. When the horses are rewilded, if they give us a 3 to 5% reduction in wildfire-related losses, that's $5 to $10 billion in annual savings just in California that we could expect. Firefighting costs are going through the roof, and we're spending, you know, billions of dollars on that too. So in summary, the implementation of Wild Horse Fire Brigade saves lives, forests, wildlife, businesses, and it protects our wild horses and saves billions annually. And the neat thing about this is we can get this done.
So we're at a crossroads here. Wild horses are being managed to extinction. Many thousands of horses are getting removed every year and then sterilized. The AMLs are way too low for genetic viability, and the remaining herds are getting aggressively treated with fertility control. We're quickly approaching the number of wild horses in America that triggered the 1971 Act. So because of those things I just listed, we're looking at a whole different picture in terms of bringing them back. If we're ever going to have any hope of having genetically viable wild horses for hundreds of years, thousands of years to come, we have to do better than fighting the existing reality because it's not working. If we don't embrace a better model for wild horse management at this rate, there's not going to be any left. So there is hope for our American icons, and that's why we're so passionate about our plan that creates a future for wild horses, that gives wild horses the win they need while recognizing that we aren't going to win against economic pressures that have put them in this position. So I hope that you'll seriously look into Wild Horse Fire Brigade, because together we can create a bright future for generations of wild equid to come. And I want to thank everyone for taking the time to listen to our presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much. I appreciate that. There was a lot of very fascinating information. Part of why I wanted to have you here is, as you know, one of our local reporters here in North Dakota featured you on the news. And I understand that, you know, when you have no control over what parts of your interview that the reporters use, and really, like, you could talk to them for hours, and right, and you've got 3 minutes that they put up on the screen. But it sounded to me like part of your plan includes removing horses from lands that they are rightfully theirs under the Wild Horse and Burro Act, and putting them somewhere else. Am I correct in that, or can you correct that if I am wrong?
No, that's incorrect. So you have to, okay, when the 71 Act was passed, we used science from the 1950s, okay? We're light years ahead of that now. We have DNA, we have paleontology that's like changing all of our understanding of equids in the world and in North America. So knowing what we know today, we can do a much better job. Now, what we have to do is we have to go back and look at all the different areas where horses got, you know, basically boxed in by a 71 Act using science from the 50s and 60s. Remember, that was the period of time when misogyny was crucifying Dr. Goodall for being a woman with a new discovery. See, you got to remember that well was a poison well we were drawing out of. So the 71 Act has great intentions. The preface of the act and the intentions of the act are golden and still valid today. The tactics and execution have to be smarter. Now, the Teddy Roosevelt horses absolutely need to stay there because that landscape, okay, we know there's been horses, that's been horse habitat for millennia. And just like with the priors, that's been habitat for millennia. We know because there's paleontological record, just like where we are, we have horse fossils.
Right. Can I
Now,
pause you for
having
a
said
second?
that,
Because I think that that's true for most wild horse herds, though, correct? Because that was my question
no,
for you. I know that,
no,
the
no,
park has sold off horses over the years, and there are people I know who have actually had to move from climates because those horses can't acclimate to like you can't take a Theodore Roosevelt horse and put it in Arizona and think it's going to be successful. It grows a winter coat. It's acclimated to this climate here and surviving when it was minus 40 a couple weeks ago. So I think that
okay,
that's the
so
same.
let me finish my answer. So, notwithstanding what I said previously, now we have to also look at the history of ranching and livestock and wild horses over the last 400 years in North America. See, what happened is horses were displaced into new areas from their normal habitats. Now, we can dig down in the ground in some of these HMAs, and there's no DNA record of horses ever using some of these areas as habitat. That's a fact. Now, how did that happen? Well, very simply, there's a book from 1930 from, I believe, Tom Holden that talks about the great cattle drives around Texas, from 1860 to 1890. Just in and around Texas, they were moving cattle and horses that they'd acquire. They moved 90 million head of cattle, or no, 50 million head of cattle, and with each cowboy needed 6 horses during some of these cattle drives, and they ended up using 600,000 horses for these cattle drives for that 40-year period. See what was happening, that was just around Texas, bringing them up to the railroad in Oklahoma and stuff. When you start looking at cattle drives, moving cattle from Texas all the way up to Oregon, Montana, Washington, or Northern California, um, horses were moved all over the place. They would acquire them from the Native Americans. They would round them up. They would round up wild horses and break them on the trail. Horses were dislocated over those 400 years into all kinds of new areas. And then on top of that, of course, a lot of them were satellites, um, uh, post Ice Age splinter populations too. Our herd here was seen in 1580 by Sir Francis Drake. So it's obviously in 1580, that's just 80 some years after Columbus set foot first time in North America. How did horses get way over here? Well, obviously they survived the Ice Age. They didn't import enough horses to show up over here in just 80 years. That's ridiculous. So we know there's splinter populations, but we also know there's reintroductions of horses as well. So, but we have a lot of landscapes. We need to reevaluate areas that are in phenomenal economic conflict. We're not going to stop that. That's the one thing we need to get through our heads. We're not going to stop these big $5 trillion a year corporation conglomerates. Okay. So if there's a landscape where you dig down in the ground, you got to fight the battles worth fighting. And you find out, hey, there's no fossil record, there's no DNA, there's never horses in this area. Somebody drew a box here. Okay, fine. Instead of rounding them up and sending them to slaughter off range holding, let's rewild them somewhere where it makes sense, where there are horse fossils, where it was natural habitat, and we got lots of those areas where there's no conflict. So, no, I'm not saying that we just randomly suddenly move horses out of the rightful areas. I'm saying we have to reevaluate, okay, where were there real native habitats? And now we have the ability to do that.
Okay. Um, but I'm guessing it's been still, these horses have been living and being born and evolving in areas where they are thriving. So I guess, so my question is, I think that it's not, so what's clear to me, and I haven't known anything about your program before today. And that's part of why I wanted to have you here. I understand, and I think that we can all appreciate, we have wildfire issues in in North America. We have wildfire issues everywhere, let's be honest, right? And we have damaged the ecosystem. Like humans are the worst, right? Like we want to talk about what to do, like we need to do something about the humans. We're the ones really contributing to all the problems we're seeing. But I'm not clear on how your program is solving the issue. And like I said, I've only heard bits and pieces on our local news. So if you're going to relocate horses, where are you relocating them to? And and how do we know that that's not going to be a problem with ranchers in that area at another time? Or what about local areas in the economies, that the tourism economies that these horses are driving to?
Okay, so Chris, I
I guess
just kind of gave you a
so.
rundown.
I guess I feel
I
like
gave
like I feel like we're giving into, like your plan, I feel like is giving into the BLM and the ranching community and not respecting the laws that were set up. And I agree, the laws need to be updated. I think everybody will agree with that. We need to update these laws because they've been bastardized over the years, especially. But I don't understand how we're not giving into the BLM and the ranching community. I mean, these horses have
Because
this land
the
rightfully set aside for them.
Right. So the reason why, Chris, is if you look at the trend over the last 30 years, the trend is to round up more and more wild horses. I mean, we're not we're not moving that needle in the opposite direction. It's getting worse and worse. And now we're getting at a crossroads where if we keep fighting this battle where the horses need to stay in the boxes that were drawn in 1971 based on faulty science, we're not going to have any horses left. So basically, the options that the wild horses have once they're removed are any excuse to euthanize them on the range when they're removed. Families are separated. The stallions are gelded. The mares are treated for children control. They either go to
Right.
long-term holding, adoption
Exactly.
incentive
So
programs.
where are you moving the
They
horses
model
to, I guess
existential.
is my question.
Okay, so I'm going to review again. There's 300 million acres of land that's not managed by BLM or U.S. Forest for horses. We have all in every horse left in America, the 40,000 that are running wild and the 70,000. Let's just say 100,000 horses all in. That's everything, okay? That out there. Okay, so if we rewilded every one of those horses at one horse for 300 acres, we only need 3 million acres, Chris. 3 million. And I just got through
Okay.
telling you that we have 354 million acres of private forest. We have that are at risk of fire, and a lot of those companies want to do anything to stop those fires because they lose their forest, they're out of business. They're forest companies. We have we have probably 300 we have 100 million acres on just on the West Coast here of land that's state, county, and federal land that doesn't involve, any kind of horse management, where there's no conflicts of interest. In other words, there's no livestock grazing permits. So if you put horses, and like I said, we only need 3 million acres, problem solved. Now, I'm not saying we move every single horse either. I'm just trying to give you a context so you can get your head around this. We're not talking about some massive deal. There's not enough horses left to even fully populate 3 million acres, let alone
So here,
300 million acres. Okay, number one. And number two, okay, with the science we have, we establish the battles we need to fight. In other words, like the Teddy Roosevelt, the Pryors, some of these other herd areas where you dig down, there's fossils, there's DNA. Those are battles you fight because they've been natural habitat through millennia. There's other boxes, Chris, where there's no fossils, you dig down, and by the way, horses do not evolve epigenetically in a matter of 400 years, okay? It takes much longer for them to change with epigenetic impacts. So, bottom
so
line, look at the conics and some of the.
would this be a viable solution then? I feel like if you want to talk about the 60,000 wild horses in BLM holding facilities, why can't these logging and ranching communities or this land that you're saying where the horses need to go, why can't we take those horses and put them there?
Well, they are part of the plan, Chris, but then they're not a reproducing population. So if you leave all the other horses that are in conflict in these HMAs and they're completely getting decimated, then that basically ends wild horses.
Right,
Yeah,
but
we need to we need to
I
protect.
understand and
We
appreciate
need
that,
to,
but couldn't that be a starting point to prove your case?
oh, well, okay, look, there's a thing called critical path thinking, okay? Um, And I've been through a lot of different training, including with the military. You got to think in terms of tactics and critical path. The horses that have the best genetics are still wild and free and haven't been treated with a whole bunch of chemicals like Gonacon and PZP, and they're out there running around and they're at risk. They are on the battlefield right now. The ones in the corral aren't going anywhere. The ones out at the Drummond Ranch ain't going anywhere. They've already been done. Whatever they're going to do to them has been done. They're walking around. They're in the corral. They're not going anywhere. Okay. That's not the exigent situation. The exigent situation are the horses that are being targeted right now, this year, to be wiped out. And that's the last bastion of good genetics. Those horses need to be in the ICU. They need to be looked at first and handled first. And the reason I brought up the excess animals, the law we have right now, humane transfer of excess animals. Okay, when they do a roundup, the first thing they do before they do anything is they have to do an excess determination. So a letter of determination after a census by the USGS is signed by a manager. So they fly around, they say, okay, there's this many horses. Okay, that's too many. We got to get rid of them. Okay, fine. Somebody signs the letter of excess determination. That letter gets signed way before any roundup. Well, guess what? The minute they sign that letter, the Humane Transfer of Excess Animals Act comes into play because they've been deemed in writing as excess. So it opens the door for advocates to team up and get those horses as families in an orderly fashion without helicopters, and then bring them into adoption programs where counties rewild them, or states or organizations. You just have to have a government authority, it could be even a fire department, city, county, state, whatever. They can get those horses by working with advocates, because they have the problem. They're getting burned alive. These people are losing their towns, their cities. Look at Paradise, look at Lahaina, look at, I mean, people need these horses in the right areas. Not everywhere. Goats are great down in the Palisades, but up in the San Gabriel Mountains or in the Malibu Mountains, or in, you have a lot of places you could put like geldings that are just, gentle giants. But in other areas, these wildland areas that we have, that are they call them fire sheds now because they're filled with grass and brush and no deer, and they just burn like crazy. We can work with the counties, cities, and states under the Humane Transfer of Excess Animals. And then as soon as they sign that letter gets signed way before the roundup. That opens the door for us to come in and say, okay, you signed the letter of excess determination. Now they're under the auspices of the Humane Transfer of Excess Animals Act. This is according to our lawyer, Michael Harris. You look at his cases that he's won. This guy knows his stuff. He's not an amateur, okay? Mike Harris, he was Friends of Animals lawyer for 7 years. Ran the law clinic. He was a professor of law at Vermont University, and he won our case for us. So he's looked at it. He goes, absolutely. The minute they sign that letter of excess determination, what comes way before the roundup, we can coordinate with our advocates and then find people that need these horses and work a cooperative deal to move them as families with no molestation. Because we need their genetics. That's the key. There's probably those 40,000 are still running around. I would bet you half of them are already sterilized. They've probably already been hit with Gonacon. So we got to do this now. They're on the critical list. They got an artery bleeding. The ones in holding, they're not going anywhere. We'll get to them. First things first.
So Bill, we only have about 5 minutes, and I'm so sorry about that, but I want to ask, number one, I would love to just have a horse talk with us so that we can answer more questions, because there's a heap of them in this, and it seems like a very engaging conversation. So again, I appreciate it. So can you just let me know what your schedule is in the next couple of weeks? Let's get together and have a longer talk. But I do want to kind of just try to run through at least a couple questions if we can. And two, I want to know, do you have a map of these areas where you're saying that we can relocate horses to? I think that that's something that people would like to know too. So if you have that, can you either send it to me?
Right. Well, okay. So regarding these areas, because we don't want a bunch of people calling other people up and kind of spoiling the too many chefs in the kitchen kind of deal. So we're keeping that under our hat. But Wild Horse Fire Brigade will be having a summit on our plan with a large number of people coming up here. We've just been so busy lately, you know, with interviews and TV and this and that and the other thing in the newspapers. So we will be conducting our own summit to address these questions specifically and very carefully and in detailed fashion. We're going to allow enough time because really to drill down on what we're talking about, it takes probably, we're probably going to have a 3-hour summit just on what we're talking about because we need an out of the box solution and we need it now. At the end of, in 2026, there won't be enough genetic material left. Everything's going to be wiped out. These horses are going to be pretty much wiped out. So,
Right, so send me an
you know, you
email.
heard,
Will you do a talk with us? Because I'm gonna have to end here, but will you do a talk with us so that we can engage a little bit more? Because we're leaving people kind of hanging here, I feel like.
yeah, yeah. Well, maybe we could do Summit 2. You know, let's talk about Summit 2.
All right, well, let me know if you're available in the next couple of weeks. I'd appreciate it because, like I said, we have a lot of other questions. Do you have an email or something that you want to give people if they, or can they go to your website and contact you and ask the questions that we're not getting to today?
Absolutely. And my apologies, everybody. So sorry about all of this. We would love to hear from you. And you go to, if you just Google Wild Horse Fire Brigade, we come right up to the top. And you can contact us through there. My personal email is GEMMASTER 7 at AOL.com. So gemmaster7. I'm also a gemologist. So anyway, gemmaster7 at AOL.com, but you could go to Wild Horse Fire Brigade and we have a contact link there and you can reach us that way too. And again, my apologies, my sincere apologies. We did want to field as many questions as we could.
Well, I appreciate it. And like I said, if you have time, even just to talk a little bit in the next couple of weeks while this is fresh in people's heads, I would appreciate it because we won't be having another summit until next January, I'm pretty sure. So thank you guys. I'm sorry we didn't get to a lot of questions, but it was really an engaging presentation. So thank you, William and Michelle. We appreciate it. And I will see everybody in a couple minutes over in the next presentation.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.